Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 23rd of December of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about a massive missile strike that took place during the night between the 22nd and the 23rd of December of 2025. We have already discussed the situation, but during the previous 12 hours we received additional updates. So today the pro-Ukrainian sources published the numbers of how many missiles and drones the Russians used for that attack. The Ukrainians are saying that Russians during the previous night attacked Ukraine with 635 drones. This is one of the biggest attacks since the beginning of the special military operation, but this is not the biggest one, so one of the biggest. Furthermore, the Russians used 35 Ha-101 missiles and Russians used 3 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. So all in all, the Ukrainians managed to bring down 621 targets. The pro-Russian sources, pro-Ukrainian sources, and neutral sources published lots of maps during the previous 12 hours where we might see the approximate routes of Russian attacks. So this is probably the most famous map. Here we can see lots of lines, lots of yellow lines, lots of red lines, blue lines. So all these lines show us the approximate routes of attacks that took place during the previous night. According to this map, as you can see, the Russians were attacking the southwestern part of Ukraine. We are talking about the Odessa region, but as you can see, the Russians were attacking facilities and infrastructure of Ukraine along the Danube River. Furthermore, the Russians attacked positions of the armed forces of Ukraine along the line of combat contact. We are talking about the territory between the cities of Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, and Slaviansk. And as you can see, the Russians were attacking the western part of Ukraine, and the biggest number of drones were used exactly in this direction. So lots of targets were attacked by Russia, and the sources are saying that mainly the Russians were attacking energy infrastructure, logistical infrastructure, and so on. And as we discussed, the Russians were attacking mainly the western part of Ukraine. During the previous 12 hours, lots of Ukrainian sources published lots of updates about the situation in the western part of Ukraine. For example, the Minister of Energy of Ukraine also reports that the Ternopil and Khmelnytsky regions are almost completely without power. As for this territory, we received several videos. For example, this is the city of Khmelnytsky, and here we can see the consequences of Russia's attack. Smoke, as you can see, was rising from the territory that the Russians struck. Furthermore, we received lots of videos from the city of Rovno, but as for the city of Rovno, we have some videos with explosions, and we have a video where we can see the blackout. So this is the city of Rivne, and this is the Rivno's blackout. So, and this is an explosion, and then the light turned off. The Ukrainian sources are saying that the situation is very critical, and this was one of the biggest strikes. So let's wait and see. But the most important thing that I would like to point to attention that the Russians haven't stopped. So the Ukrainians reported that Russians used 600 drones and missiles altogether. The pro-Ukrainian sources published this map, but these two articles show us the situation, let's say, between 10 p.m. of the 22nd of December and let's say 7 or 8 or 9 a.m. of the 23rd of December. But the Russians continue attacks, and the Russians are still attacking the territory of Ukraine with drones and missiles. Maybe tomorrow we will receive additional updates that will clarify the situation in this, let's say, sphere. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation on the ground. And first let's talk about the Zaporozhye direction, where the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their position significantly. First let's talk about the city of Guliai-Polye, and as you can see, the map has been adjusted. Now we see that Russians control lots of territories, and let's compare the map between the dates. First, this is the situation by the end of the 22nd of December. So as you can see, according to the yesterday's configuration, Russians controlled up to 25% of the settlement. We have at least 25% as a gray zone, or the territory covered with the fog of shadow, fog of war, and 50% of the city of Guliai-Polye were under control of the armed forces of Ukraine. But at the by the end of the 23rd of December of 2025, the map has been adjusted significantly. Now Russians, according to this configuration, control up to 50% of the settlement. There is a 10% of gray zone and just 40% under control of the armed forces of Ukraine. So Ukrainians control less and less territories. The battle is entering its final phase. So we have adjustments. As you can see, some of the territories were colored as a gray zone based on the reports that were published by neutral mappers. Some of the territories were adjusted based on the videos that were published by Ukrainian sources. Here we can see lots of episodes how Ukrainians were attacking Russians through the territory of the city of Guliapole and the territory around the settlement. And lots of episodes, as you can see in one of these episodes was geolocated right exactly at this point, and another episode was geolocated along the Persha Travnya street, so exactly at this point. So based on these reports, based on the reports published by neutral mappers, we adjusted the map. The clashes are taking place along the Shevchenko street, and this is the final phase of the battle for the city of Guliapole. Furthermore, the Russians continue bombing or started bombing and attacking territory strongholds to the west of the city of Guliapole, probably preparing themselves before the beginning of a major rush right after the end of the battle for the settlement. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of the battle for the bridgehead on the Ukrainian side of the river of Gaichul. So as you can see, this part of the map has been adjusted as well. This is the situation by the end of the 21st of December. This is the 22nd of December. We received the report yesterday that Russians managed to answer the settlement of Andreevka and to improve their positions. And by the end of the 23rd of December, we received lots of updates that confirm complete control over the territory by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. So as you can see, the map has been adjusted. We colored this territory under control of Russian units, and we made this adjustment based on this video published by pro-Russian sources. So here we can see how exactly the clashes for the settlement of Andreevka were taking place. The Russians were bombing the settlement with aviation, with artillery. The Russians then were securing the territory with FPV drones, and later Russians launched infantry. And in the final part of this video, we can see at least 4 episodes with Russian soldiers that were raising the Russian flag through the settlement of Andreevka. So based on this video, based on the report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, based on the report of the Group of Forces East, we adjusted the map and we colored these territories under complete control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Now it's clear and it's obvious that Russians will continue offensive, and most likely the settlement of Bratsky is the next task for the Group of Forces East. They will try to attack the settlement from the south, from the east, from the northeast. They will try to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this area, and the settlement of Bratsky, if Russians take the settlement under control, the settlement of Bratsky is going to become the third settlement on the Ukrainian side of the river of Gaichul. And from this very moment, we can say that Russians created a very powerful, strong foothold on the Ukrainian side of the river, because from these positions, Russians most likely will try to intensify their offensive operation towards the city of Zaporozhye. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area between the cities of Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka. We have one common, these are 2 different directions, but we have one common thing for both directions. The Russians, once again, after a very long operational pause, began using armored vehicles for offensive purposes. Not just armored vehicles, but mechanized convoys for offensive purposes. So we have adjusted the map. As you can see, one of the adjustments took place in the northwestern part of the settlement of Pokrovsk, but this time we made an adjustment based on the report that was published by pro-Russian sources. Here we can see how Russians were attacking Ukrainians. During the previous days, Ukrainians made lots of attempts to answer the northwestern part of the settlement. As of now, it's unclear. It's very difficult to understand whether the Ukrainians managed to dig in deeper, whether we are going to see a flag, Ukrainian flag, in coming days in the northwestern part of the city. Most likely we will. Most likely, even if there are no Ukrainian positions there, most likely Ukrainians, when they landed, they managed to make a video, and what happens next probably will stay in the city of Pokrovsk. So that is why we will see a video, obviously, but the question is whether the possible upcoming video will correspond and will have anything common with the reality on the ground. Furthermore, the Russians began using convoys once again. We have lots of videos from the Dobropolye-Konstantinovka direction where we might see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians with artillery and with FPV drones. For example, in this video we can see at least 4 armored vehicles and infantry fighting carriers that were trying to cross this area and to land infantry in this dense network of the fortifications in the area of the settlement of Zatishek. Most likely there are very heavy clashes for this territory. Most likely the Russians managed to take these positions. As for the Konstantinovka direction, here we can see the same story, but now the Russians are tasked to establish complete control over everything, let's say, to the bottom of this red line. So there are the settlements of Stepanovka, Berestok, and the Russians are tasked to improve their positions in this area and basically to prepare footholds to the southwest of the settlement of Konstantinovka with the purpose to continue assault operation on the city itself. So what we have convoys, we have armored vehicles, we have lots of vehicles that were approaching the settlement of Stepanovka from the southwest. Based on this video, based on these episodes, we can make a conclusion that most likely Russians managed to improve their positions through this dense network of the fortifications, and as we discussed in the previous video, most likely Russians managed to enter the southwestern part of the settlements, so currently there are very heavy clashes. Furthermore, the sources confirmed Russian control, that the Russians began advancing to the north of the Kliban-Bytska water reservoir. This was reported by natural mappers. Furthermore, from the southwestern part of the city of Konstantinovka, we received lots of videos how Russians were attacking vehicles and equipment of the armored forces of Ukraine in this area. So all these attacks means just about one thing: the Russians established a certain, let's say, FPV drone control over the territory just with one purpose: to control the traffic and not to allow the Ukrainians to introduce additional reinforcements and reserves from this area in the southern direction. So Russians established control, and most likely, according to this number of updates, the Russians were, let's say, pretty effective. Most likely lots of vehicles were damaged and destroyed, and the reinforcements that was expected in this part of the area hasn't arrived. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Sever Slavians direction. As for this territory, we have lots of changes, but most of them haven't been confirmed with, let's say, geolocations. But the most important thing is that currently the Sever Slavians direction has the biggest pace of offensive operation. For example, when talking about the Zaporozhye direction, this direction has the biggest pace of offensive 4 or 5 months ago, but when Russians approached the settlement of Gulyai-Polye, the river of Gaichul, the Russians were slowed down. So the Russians are at the same line, the Russians have been at the same line for more than months or something like this, because there are very heavy clashes, and this is the most important line that the Russians are tasked to capture. And now the Russians are advancing in the Sever's direction, and they're moving really fast. So these are the changes on the ground between the dates, and this is, for example, the end of the 20th of December, when pro-Ukrainian sources confirmed that the city of Seversk, most likely that Ukrainians abandoned their positions from the territory of the city. And by the way, today this information was also officially confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources by the General Staff. And starting from the 20th of December, we've been adjusting the map almost every single day, and as you can see, the changes are very big, especially the latest changes between the 22nd and 23rd. As you can see, lots of fields, tree lines, and fortifications were captured by Russians to the west of the river of Bakhmutka. So we're talking about these territories, and this information today was confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources, by neutral mappers, and by pro-Russian sources. So the Russians, as you can see, are advancing in the northwestern direction using broad front line attack. They're moving in the direction of Alexandrovka. They're moving in the direction of the main logistic roads, and as we discussed in the previous videos, it's clear that Russians are tasked to improve their positions until they get this red line. So from these positions, Russians will be able to establish certain artillery control over the Slavyanska power station. This is currently the most important, let's say, territory for both the Russians and the Ukrainians, because lots of things depends on the Slavyanska power station. The distance to the power station from this red line is less than, let's calculate the distance, is less than 10 kilometers, right? Which means that Russians will be able to establish artillery control, FPV drone control, and most likely the power station would be damaged, obviously, which will lead to the blackout situation in Slaviansk-Kramatorsk. So this is the line, and this is the first task for Russians. When blackout starts, of course, the civilian population would be forced to evacuate from this agglomeration towards the west, in the western direction towards the mainland. So, and then the battle for Slaviansk-Kramatorsk begins. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the Kupiansk direction. The most important thing is that we haven't received almost anything from the Kupiansk direction. This is the most important piece of news. Ukrainians started their greatest Kupiansk counter-offensive operation at the beginning of December, and the Ukrainians during the previous 20 days managed to improve their positions significantly, but the Ukrainians haven't managed to complete their main task. They haven't managed to secure completely the western bank of the river Oskol. The Russians, this is very important, managed to save their positions on the Ukrainian side of the river. Ukrainians probably seems to be pretty exhausted during these months. Now they are very exhausted, most likely. They haven't managed to finish the battle for the western bank of the river Oskol by the 23rd of December, and most likely they will not be able to finish this task by the end of the year. Obviously, Russians will use this advantageous situation. We don't expect that Russians will begin counter-offensive operation today or tomorrow, but it seems that by the end of the year, the Russians will try to improve their positions and to restore control over the territories they lost. The most important thing for Russians that they managed to save their positions on the western bank of the river Oskol, and they managed to exhaust Ukrainian forces in this area. Ukrainians, it seems, are no longer able to continue counter-offensive operation, not just because they're pretty exhausted, but also due to a critical situation in the area of the city of Sumy around the settlement of Volchansk. We are not talking about Zaporozhye, Siversk, and so on. We're talking just about the areas of responsibilities of the groups of forces north and west. So the Kharkiv direction, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions around the settlement of Prilipovka. And you know that there is a very important thing I would like to point to attention, that, for example, during the decisive offensive operation, assault units of the 74th Separate Battalion, the 41st Motorized Rifle Regiment, 44th Army Corps. So Russians are calling and they're naming units that were involved in the battle for Prilipka. Furthermore, the Russians did the same yesterday when they were talking about the settlement of Vilcha. But as for the settlement of Vilcha, they named completely different units that were involved. So I'm trying to tell you that recently the Russians have redeployed a very strong reinforcement in the direction of the settlement of Volchansk, most likely with the purpose to launch a major offensive operation. I cannot tell you the exact number of forces that were fresh forces, which is the most important sentence, were redeployed in this direction, but most likely this number of forces is enough to continue offensive operation almost until the settlement of Bely Kolodets, or even further and deeper inside of the Kharkiv region. So this is the most important. Russians deployed fresh forces and they will continue offensive operation. As for the Sumy direction, as we discussed, Ukrainians were forced to take some units from this area and to redeploy them in the direction of the city of Kupiansk. The Russians used that situation and Russians began their counter-offensive. As for the end of the 21st of December, we received a report that Russians improved their positions around Andreevka, Alexeyevka, and as of the end of the 23rd of December, we received the report that Russians improved their positions around Yunakiivka. So based on these two reports between the 21st and 23rd of December, we can make a conclusion that Russians are moving and are heading the next defense layer between the current positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation and the city of Sumy. We are talking about these small villages, this number of villages between Russia's positions and the city of Sumy itself. We are talking about Mala Karchakovka, Karchakovka, Nova Sich, Marina, Kyanitsa, Ivolzhanskaya, Pisarevka. So the Russians are heading towards these villages, and most likely in coming days we'll start receiving first updates from this defense layer, which is a very important defense layer, because if Russians can take this layer under control, the Russians will be able to answer this huge Sumy forest, and then under the protection of FPV drones, the Russians will continue offensive further in the southern direction with the purpose to get the Sumy agglomeration itself from the north. And that's it for today. Military with Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.